Good Moment Baseball Universe. What is up? It's your boy Jake the Snake Robinson coming out of Hawley's Island, South Carolina. And, this is like take two, but I'm going to do what I got to do. The show must go on. I'm very interested into talking to today's guest. I wanted to make sure that somehow I got this up. And as soon as someone out there can tell me that they can hear me and they can hear me well, I will proceed with the show. I'm going to do everything I can to bring it to you. That's for sure. I see Chanel McCaskill out there. So I'm seeing you, but I'm hoping and I'm wondering if you guys can hear me. Because if you can't hear me, then it kind of defeats the purpose of me sitting behind a microphone. Belzito, can you hear me? Can anyone hear me? Okay, good to go. That's all I wanted to hear. All right, so Jake Robinson from the Jake Robinson Sports Experience. I'm doing the another show that I do called Launch Angle. This is take two of this. It's gonna work out. We're gonna be fine. We're gonna get through all this. It is the COVID experience. So, like I said, I'm gonna be talking to an author today, Rick Allen, and he came out with this book. It's called Inside Pitch. And I don't know if you can see it very well there, but there it is right there. It's Inside Pitch. And it's a very good book about the Seattle Pilots going into bankruptcy and literally one baseball season. It's a great story. And I have Rick lined up here. Let's see if I can give him a call. And this will be take two.
Rick Allen here.
Mr. Allen, how are you? This is Jake Robinson from the Let's Talk Baseball Podcast Network. We're going through our little difficulties here today, but we're going to make it. The show must go on. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing good. Mariners are up 4-0 now. So.
Oh, well, see, there you go. Maybe if I don't speak to you, I'm kind of like the good luck deal here, right?
Yeah.
So we were talking earlier, and you said that you have baseball roots in Los Angeles. It started in Los Angeles, and what was the first baseball game that you said you went to?
It was 1958, the first year the Dodgers moved from Brooklyn to Los Angeles. I was living just south of Los Angeles, and it was a doubleheader between the new Dodgers in L.A.
Right.
and the Milwaukee Braves. It was a doubleheader with Don Drysdale and Johnny Padres pitching against Lou Burdette and Warren Spahn. And that's the year that Milwaukee won the World Series and the Dodgers came in dead last.
Right.
And the Dodgers won both of those games, 7-4 and 4-3. That was my introduction to baseball.
And I'm pretty sure you were pretty much hooked from that point forward. I mean, after seeing that, I can only imagine watching all those future All-Stars and Hall of Famers.
There was Hall of Famers all over the field. I mean, it was just something else. And of course, I was already hooked because I was living there, and the Dodgers had moved from Brooklyn into L.A. At the time, they didn't have a baseball team on the West Coast, so that was a huge deal. And Los Angeles and San Francisco and all that kind of stuff. It just was a huge deal. So I was hooked right away.
And before that happened, as a West Coast kid, how did you consume baseball, numbers and information? Did you used to go through the radios, KMOX out in Missouri? Like, how was baseball given to the West Coast before the Dodgers or any of these teams came out there?
Well, I really don't know because I was like, let's see, how old was I? I was like 10. And so before that, I was actually living with my grandparents at that time, and my mom was a coach and a ball player herself. So my memory of baseball before the Dodgers was my mom on a baseball field in satin green uniforms playing third base.
Okay.
She was a heck of a good ball player. She was a really good ball player. And a good coach. So I wasn't hooked into baseball until the Dodgers moved to the West Coast.
Right.
But I was hooked into it in another way through my mom, of course.
Right.
So it's always been part part of my blood, but not Major League Baseball.
Well, it's interesting because I wonder that. So I bet you there was a lot of kids that probably baseball just didn't resonate with them until they got out, to playing in California and such. Now, how did what did you like move to Washington? How did your transference go from the Dodgers to what was going on in Seattle as far as the baseball scene there?
Well, what happened is we moved to Washington State. We moved to a little town called Lisle, Washington, right across from the Dalles, Oregon, and it was a town of about 500. And I was a good ball player by then, so I was kind of the star on the little league team and all that kind of stuff. So I was hooked into baseball, and the Dodgers were still my team. And then the Dodgers moved their AAA team into Spokane, which is also on Washington, which is on the eastern side of the state of Washington as well.
Right.
So we ended up moving to Spokane, and I worked in the ballpark for the Spokane Indians in the 1959, 60, 61 years, and they had a lot of their upcoming stars, Maury Wills and Davis, the Davis guys, Davis brothers, Frank Howard, all those guys were coming up through Spokane. So I kind of was still hooked into the Dodgers, and then we moved to the west side of the state of Washington. And by 1969, I had graduated from high school and was in college. And in 1969, when the pilots started and also stopped,
right,
when they started up, I was in ROTC and in summer camp.
Okay. So
I didn't attend a single game. I never got to see one single game of the pilots. And honestly, I didn't have the faintest. I mean, I knew they went bankrupt.
Right.
And I knew that there was all kinds of, different problems. And I knew Milwaukee got them. And, of course, in our state, Bud Selig was the big, the guy everybody blamed because he bought them.
Right.
But that's all I knew about them.
Well, it's fun.
3 years ago, I ended up in Africa on a tour of Africa with my wife. And we were with a small tour group of about 25 people. And didn't know any of them. And a guy's at the dinner table, and he starts talking about his time in baseball, telling funny stories. And he was an administrator. And I said, "Well, who are you with?" And he said, at the time, I was the 21-year-old chief financial officer of the Seattle Pilots. And, of course, I read Ball 4, great book.
Right.
And I said, "You got to be kidding me. You were the chief financial officer?" So I said, "Tell me some more stories." And we met back up in the States after we came back. He lives in Arizona, and we're down in Arizona for spring training. We met up again, and that's that's where the book came from, Africa. And
that person that you met was Bob Schoenbeckler. How do you pronounce that? Is it Schoenbeckler?
Schoenbeckler, you're right. Yeah, you're right. Second.
And that was the person that you met. Now, before we get started more into this book, I got to tell you, I drew a lot of correlations from your book. When I was a kid, growing up in Baltimore, I sat back and watched my football team lose, and in a lot of ways, Irsay was, the demigod of my city, and Modell eventually becomes the hero to my city. And I draw parallels in a lot of these ways with the story that you're telling here about franchises moving. I know what it means to watch a franchise, sneak out in the middle of the night. We won't talk about that. I got issues with that still. But, I know what that pain feels like. And you're saying that you really had no knowledge of Pilots baseball, but you met this accountant. And is this how the evolution of the story begins? You start interviewing this guy, or how does that start?
Because, well, first of all, I have, I knew that the franchise started. I knew that they left, and I knew it took them 7 years to get a team back to Seattle, and I knew everybody was pissed off about it. And so I knew that. And I've always had an interest in the business side of things.
Much like Bob.
Right. So Bob's sitting there talking about the business side of a team that's really famous because of Ball 4. Jim Bouton's book, Ball 4, was all about that team, except it was from the bottom up.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, golly, this is a story about this same team.
Right.
All the characters in the front office who just sounded just as weird and just as funny as everything in Ball 4 of the players.
Yeah, and that's
really
one of the
interesting.
I'm sorry.
contrast.
I was going to say that's one of the very interesting aspects of your book, because I feel like your book is kind of a piggyback on Ball 4, which I read a long time ago, and it makes me now want to read that book again.
Oh, you should.
You see, like, the characters in the clubhouse in the Ball 4 aspect. Now yours is more from a front office aspect. Now you start talking to Bob, and I would assume that the story is really through Bob's eyes, and in some way Jim Kittlesby. Would I be correct in saying that?
Yeah, that's correct.
And who was Jim Kittlesby?
Well, you won't believe this. What a coincidence. So I'm talking to Bob. We're in Arizona after the trip to Africa, the first year after back, and I'm talking to Bob, and I'm saying, he's telling me these stories, and while he's talking, he says, yeah, and I knew a guy named Jim, and we're still friends, and he's down here in Arizona. And he says, Jim Kittlesby was working with me. And I said, that's funny. I know a guy named Jim Kittlesby from Pacific Lutheran University, where I used to work.
Right.
And he says, yeah, that's him. And I said, what? I had no idea that this guy who I worked with for 7 years at PLU, the university, had worked for the pilots. He had never mentioned it. And so I said, well, is Jim around here in Arizona? He says, yeah. So I got the two of them together, and they started talking to each other, and then the stories started flying. You know how memories go when you get guys together who work together for years.
Sure.
And that's where the book started. All I did was listen to it and try to organize it and let them tell their story. And I was trying really hard to stay true to their memories and the things that stuck out in their minds to them. So there's places where, like Bob talks about going to this Hollywood show that he got to see.
Right.
And some people have commented, well, that's kind of off the point. Man, but to me, it wasn't. It was like, here's this 21-year-old wide-eyed kid,
right,
suddenly thrust into the L.A. upper echelon of baseball, going to these things, and he's just walking around with his jaw hanging down. So the stories are all authentic. They're all from these guys, and I found it really interesting. Of course, I have a degree in administration, so my interest and also journalism.
Right.
So the combination of
money,
being interested in the story from the perspective of news and from the perspective of business
sure,
was a really interesting combination. And how money, you're talking about moving franchises. I think one of the reasons this book resonates with a lot of people interested in the business side of baseball is because of exactly what you identified, that there are so many cities where so many teams have left those cities and kind of been left in the wake because somebody else had more money and wanted to give them more money, and they went somewhere and they didn't really have any loyalty to the city.
Right.
So it really resonates with a lot of people that way.
It certainly does. And I found that through the reading the book. I actually learned a lot of things, but one of the things that I found really interesting is Jim Kittlesby is from Montana, correct? And one of the things I learned is there's no high school baseball in Montana since 1947.
I didn't know that either.
South Dakota and Wyoming, they don't have high school baseball at all in these states.
I know. I was shocked. He made it. He was good enough to play in college as first string guy in college.
Exactly.
Without baseball in high school.
I mean, he must have been truly a magnificent natural baseball player for someone that doesn't even have high school baseball in their state. That is a remarkable fact that I never knew. There is no high school baseball in the state of Montana since 1947, and there's no high school baseball in South Dakota and Wyoming. I found that very, very interesting. Now, two more characters in the story that we have to mention is Dewey and Max Soriano. Speak on them. Yeah. Tell us who they were.
Well, Dewey and Max, they were really good baseball people, but they weren't rich. I mean, they were just real solid baseball guys who loved the game. They ran the Seattle Rainiers AAA franchise, and Dewey was president of the Pacific Coast League in the 1950s and 60s. So it's not like they didn't know baseball. They knew baseball, but they were not with the wealthy people in Seattle. They weren't connected there. So they had been trying to, and Seattle had led the league or was at the top of the league for 15 straight years in all of the minor league baseball in attendance. So their thinking was, this is a baseball town. We just had the World's Fair, where Elvis Presley goes to the Space Needle and all that stuff. So they're trying to make it a big league town. And so they've been negotiating and trying to figure out how they can bring this team in and do it without too much money. And so baseball was in an expansion phase. And unfortunately, what happened was Charlie Finley decided to just up and leave, speaking of moving franchises, just up and leave Kansas City after Kansas City had, fixed the stadium and given all kinds of money.
Right.
And he just up and left. And baseball didn't want him to leave, but he said, "I don't care. I'm going there anyway."
Right.
Well, when he did that, Kansas City said, "Well, we're going to sue baseball.
Yeah.
And we're going to take away your exemptions that allow you to run this thing as a monopoly if you don't stick a team back here."
And this is
baseball.
They said this is the antitrust shield you're speaking of, right? The
exactly.
Missouri senator, I believe his name was what was his name? Stewart.
Yeah, Stuart Symington.
Symington, that's right, Stuart Symington.
Yeah.
And he brings up the antitrust shield, and what you're speaking on is how Kansas City decides they're going to sue Major League Baseball. They're gone. This is going to happen, correct?
Right.
And this has an impact.
I don't want that to happen.
Right, and this has an impact on Seattle because Seattle was woefully not ready to do this.
No.
But because they want to even and balance the leagues out, they kind of throw Seattle to the wolves, correct?
Absolutely. In my view, that's exactly what happened. Because when the Sorianos first started to do this deal, they were told they were going to have a 2 or 3 or 4 year lead-in period. So we could buy the AAA team from the California Angels, and which was in Seattle, and then run the team for a 2 or 3 year kind of learn how to do it, get ready for Major League Baseball, grow your money people, get them into the game, and 3 years from now, get a new stadium, in the works. And then we'll bring a Major League team in. Well,
Right.
that all got short-circuited by 2 or 3 years, and that just screwed them. I mean, right there, they were on their way down.
And
they had to get extra money from an outside buyer to help buy the team. The stadium was in total disrepair. It was just one thing after. They had to make some quick hires that they shouldn't have made.
Right.
And it was downhill from there.
Yeah, and not only that, not only those moves in the front office that were detrimental. We'll certainly get to those, but they had an awful concessions deal. They had no television revenue sharing, and meanwhile, Oakland's not getting a bad deal over here. You know what I mean? Like, they got a nice new stadium that they're going on, and Seattle's got 6 stadium, and that's probably a pretty good name for that stadium because it was awful. Speak on to what 6 Stadium was all about.
Well, I mean, they were building the seats in 6 Stadium opening day.
Opening day.
They had guys with walkie-talkies up in the stands calling in the seat numbers as they were being built.
Oh, my God.
While people were standing outside waiting to buy tickets on opening day.
Can you imagine?
Yeah, no, I can't.
I can't either.
And they had porta potties outside the stadium for people to use the bathroom because the plumbing didn't work. The guys on the press box could not flush the toilets
Right.
until the 7th inning because of the bad plumbing. It's called the 7th inning flush.
7th inning flush.
So yeah, it was just one thing after another. So the stadium, the field actually, the playing field, it was in good shape, the playing field, but nothing else was major league ready. I mean, it was a bad minor league ballpark.
Right, and the funny thing is that they never really had any really good sellouts that year, and when they did have a sellout, it was on Bats Day, and that was even more chaotic because they ran out of bats because they didn't think enough people were going to show up at the stadium. I mean, even the days where they actually had good attendance, it burned them. I mean, everything that team tried to do that first season was, pretty bad indeed.
It was like the perfect storm in the wrong direction.
It really was.
Their 2 biggest days were Bat Day and Opening Day. Opening Day, they had people ripping their seats out and the seat of their pants out on the bad lumber they were putting into the seats. They had people sitting on seats that had just been painted and they had to pay for their pants.
Right.
They had, they had stuff falling apart all over the place. They couldn't flush the toilets. One guy, later in the season, got drunk and got stuck in one of the porta potties and was there all night long.
Was stuck there all night. That's crazy. That was a crazy story. They actually found him the next morning, the construction crew, while they're out there working on the stadium. Unbelievable stories, like you would never believe it. Now, one of the characters that you talked about was a bad hire in the front office, and as soon as they were hiring these guys, they were almost firing. It almost looked like a presidential administration at this point these days. People were coming in and people were going out. You know what I'm saying? In comes the poop, out goes the poop. So
I don't think 6 of them were indicted though.
Yeah, good point. But one of the host of cronies, I could say that we're talking about here was Marvin Milks, and he was as bad as they come, and he even transferred into a little bit of Bud Selig, which we'll talk about down the road. But why don't you give us an impression of what Marvin Milks, what was his job, and how did people kind of react to Marvin Milks?
Well, here's how the Marvin Milks thing. This is one of the things that Dewey Soriano said in a later interview, like 10 or 15 years later, was, I was really naive. I thought people were trying to do me a favor and help me out. But as time has gone by, it's clear that they kind of took advantage of me. He said, so Marvin Milks was with the California Angels. He was the assistant general manager. And he was there when they were an expansion team. So obviously, already having worked with an expansion team, it looked good on paper. He was also in charge of the AAA Seattle Angels affiliate when he was with California. So he already knew Seattle. So he looked good. And when the Angels sold the franchise to Seattle, I don't have anything to confirm this, but I think part of the deal was, we'll give you Marvin Milks. And Dewey, thinking it looked so great on paper, thought that was a favor. But, everybody knew about Marvin. He was a yeller and a screamer. He kicked holes in the desk. He didn't listen to anybody. I think the Angels knew what was up and shuffled him off to Buffalo, only in this case it was Seattle, and really got rid of somebody that they knew
was a cancer. Yeah, and even Bud.
So he gets up there and he doesn't listen to anybody. He has a really bad draft because he won't listen to his scouts. He starts yelling and screaming at people, and right away it's just a really bad work environment for a lot of people there.
Right, and he winds up staying with Milwaukee for a year, and even Bud Selig says it's one of the worst mistakes he made in the whole transition process was keeping Marvin Milks. And Marvin Milks, for what it's worth, man, he had quite a run between, two teams here that, he was not very highly respected or regarded in any respect. Now, one of the things that I did find interesting and that you didn't really dig into too much was while they were constructing the 6th stadium in Seattle, you kind of implied that dudes were talking about the Sorianos had connections with Joey Bonanno, the Bonanno family in New York City. Were those ever to be found to be true, or was this kind of just like the scuttlebutt kind of gossip around the construction sites?
Well, first of all, Bonanno at the time was living in in Arizona. Sorry.
Okay.
During the spring, spring and winter.
Oh.
And he apparently had his fingers in the construction industry down there. And I think it was Jim Kittlesby. I think it was Jim Kittlesby or Bob. I can't remember which. Told the story about the construction guys. Always saying, they were friends of Joe's and blah, 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 and all this kind of stuff. And Bob didn't know who they were, he's a 21-year-old kid. He didn't know what was going on.
Right.
And it turns out later that they were talking about, we're friends of Joe Bonanno. So, and I don't think the Sorianos were closely connected, but what happened was they ran into problems with money. They ran into problems with having to make sure things got done quickly without any stoppage. And I think because of that, they got themselves wrapped up with people who just weren't doing them any favors.
Do you think people were stealing from them at some point?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Do I can't prove that, but it's
right.
There's even a case where Bob and one of the auditors went into the ticket selling operation at Six Stadium in the evening to try to see if they could find any paperwork that told them that money was disappearing.
Right.
It was such a loosey-goosey, put together, way too quick operation. And there's just all kinds of places where people could be taking advantage and they wouldn't know it because they didn't have the time to put things together. It just was loosey-goosey.
Yeah, and that's why I asked that, because that's an environment where, it would seem very possible for people to be skimming off the top when you have all these hands inside, what's going on, and you haven't even got a baseball stadium up yet. I mean, I just can't imagine the chaos that's going on. Now, Jim Kittlesby, he has a big job. You have to understand that the Vietnam War is going on right at this time in America. Jim Kittlesby is not only trying to draft a baseball team, but he's got to keep these guys out of the draft, which has got to be very difficult. I can't even comprehend how hard that's got to be. And it becomes like this college pipeline and a liaison between the Seattle Pilots and these young players. How does that kind of evolve into place?
Well, Jim had he wasn't really in charge of the draft. He just got lucky to be able to stand up and name the names. The scouts and all that, and Marvin Mills were kind of in charge.
Sure.
But he was kind of the front person.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he was the front person for a lot of things, and as one person after another fell by the wayside. And in the book, there's stories about 2 or 3 guys who get fired along the way. And every time somebody got fired, because Jim was somebody they could count on, he kept getting his responsibilities added. And player relationships and stuff like that became one of those responsibilities. In fact, he ran the spring training for him, spring training operations. Because he was involved with running spring training operations and fall league operations, he got to know all these up-and-coming guys. So, and it was Middle Vietnam. I was there at the time. I said I was in ROTC, so I was like 20 years old, and it was right when everybody was trying to figure out how do I avoid going to war, and how do I get out of this, how do I sign up for the, my local National Guard, how do I go, what do I do about my bone spurs, how do I do all that? So he just got assigned and became kind of the conduit for other teams as well, and they'd call him up and they'd say, hey, we got a guy we really want to protect here. Can you get him into a junior college, or can you get him into a college so that he won't get drafted because there's still college deferments?
Right.
And so he was doing that all the time. One of the guys who did that for was Tom Kelly, who was a minor leaguer at the time in the Seattle system. And Kelly ended up being the manager for 2 World Series teams.
Yeah.
But, much later.
Yeah.
But little things like that.
Right. That's pretty amazing. Now, let's go to draft night real quick. I don't want to lose sight on this before I forget about it. Draft night goes down, like you said. Milks is kind of running the show. Something happens with the list, and something happens with a certain player named Lou Piniella. What is the fiasco that goes on there?
Well, Marvin. Marvin was held as he was held things pretty tightly to himself.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not listening to a lot of people. The team decides that because they're going to have to depend so much on the attendance for the only revenue that they're going to have, that they gotta draft guys who are older,
right,
well known,
mm-hmm.
or somebody knows, or they're going to blossom right away. So Lou Piniella, so they begin to draft older guys like Tommy Davis, who used to be a Dodger, really good hitter for the Dodgers. Older guy, and they draft a number of older guys thinking, okay, everybody's going to recognize them, we'll get better attendance. Well, they forgot that after about 2 months, all those guys would be hurt and not able to walk. So their whole thing fell apart after about 2 months. But anyway, Lou Piniella was one of the guys they drafted. They drafted him from Cleveland. Lou was a 27-year-old rookie that everybody thought was going to be a pretty darn good player, but he just never got an opportunity. He had actually been with Cleveland twice and was drafted in expansion draft twice from Cleveland, once to Washington and once to, I think it was Washington, and once to Seattle. Well, so Lou is their top hitter in spring training. He's doing really well. But Luke's got a reputation for being a real hothead.
You think?
And when he was 27,
right,
he was probably much worse.
Okay.
Well, they hired a manager named Joe Schultz, and everybody knew Joe as a good old guy, funny, kind of laid back, and loosey goosey. Let's go get a beer. And Lou, of course, is intense as hell. And Marvin Milks doesn't like guys who talk back either. So Lou gets on the outside of both Marvin Milks and Joe Schultz because it's just not a good fit. So on April Fool's Day, after spring training is over, after he's the leading hitter in spring training, one of the leading hitters, they trade him on April Fool's Day, right before the season starts, to Kansas City, the other team. Milks trades him.
Unbelievable.
Gets nothing back in return.
Right.
And Lou goes on to be the American League Rookie of the Year for the Kansas City team.
And another thing that blows me about it, too, is because we know, looking back now, that Oakland's going to win 3 World Series coming up, you know what I mean, in 72, 73, and 74. And meanwhile, Seattle lasts one season and goes, really, face down hard into the concrete. Yeah. Explain to the audience why Kansas City / Oakland was such a better situation than what Seattle was dealing with.
Well, first of all, Kansas City all of Kansas City had just lost a team. So when they got a team, the whole city was behind them. Businesses were behind them. All the small businesses that lots of money were behind them. They already had a major league stadium that had just been in use a year before. It was a nice stadium, and there's a picture of the contrast between the two stadiums in the book, and you could see the difference pretty clearly.
Yes, you can.
And so they already had cachet in the town. Everybody's yelling and screaming with joy that they were coming back. So, and they had the money interest in back of them. They had all that going in Kansas City. And then, of course, Seattle trades them their best player, and he gets Rookie of the Year. So everything went right for Kansas City, while at the same time everything went wrong for Seattle. And of course, in the meantime, Bud Selig is looking for a team because he was owner, the biggest public stock owner in the Milwaukee Braves when they left in 1966. And so he had been sitting there with a group looking for a team to bring to Milwaukee. And, in my mind, he'd already made a deal for the Chicago White Sox in 1969.
Yes.
And he took it to Chicago, to the American League, and they said, no, Chicago at the time was the second biggest town in the United States. They said, we want both an American League and a National League team there. We're not going to approve this deal.
Right.
So he had already bought a team, and then it got turned down. So he was sitting there on the sidelines, and I'm sure somebody in the owners group said to him, hey, hang around, because this Seattle deal, it's bad right from day one.
And again, for me, this goes back to Art Modell. Art Modell was kind of in the same situation where, he was one of the few NFL owners who actually said, look, man, you guys, Baltimore, the Colts should stay right where they're at. They shouldn't leave. But at the same time, I know that, the later waning years when he wasn't getting his stadium deal done in Cleveland, I know in the back of his mind, he was looking at Baltimore that had all this money set aside for a stadium. And in the back of his mind, I know the light bulbs are going off, and I kind of think it's almost the same thing here with Selig. Now, before we get to Selig, there was a guy that you mentioned in the story, and I don't want to forget this. It was Bill Daly, I believe, and there was some point in the story where the Cleveland Indians were actually almost moving to Seattle. How real, how credible was that?
It was very credible. It was right after the World's Fair in 1962 in Seattle. It was 1964. Bill Daly owned the Cleveland Indians. He was looking serious. Man, they had terrible attendance. He was looking for, in fact, Cleveland, even in 1969, I think Cleveland was one of 4 teams that had worse attendance than Seattle had.
Right.
But attendance was Seattle's only revenue, so they got screwed.
Yeah, and you shouldn't gloss over that either, because the Pilots because they have such a shitty revenue deal and they'd have no concessions, like they are forced to have to draw fans. And if they're not drawing fans, they're going broke. They outdrew the White Sox, Indians, Phils, and San Diego, but it didn't matter because it still wasn't enough. They had no other revenue generated. They didn't have revenue pipelines for that team, correct?
Correct. That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, Major League, the American League said, well, we'll each give some money to Seattle to try to keep the team in Seattle because we're going to look really bad if we don't.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if they'd have done that up front and had revenue sharing to a greater degree, they might have been. They had a chance, but they didn't do it, and they didn't do it until they got in real trouble, and then it was too late. So it wasn't going to work. So anyway, back to Daly for just a second. So Daly was with Cleveland. He was trying to move him to Seattle. He decided not to do it. I can't remember for what particular reason, but he didn't make it. But when the Sorianos needed a partner to help them pay for this team 3 years early, Daly was the guy that was sent to them by the American League. He was connected to them by the league and said, here's a guy who's interested in Seattle. He's got money. And so he bought 49% of the partnership to be in Seattle. So Daly himself actually ended up in Seattle. He just wasn't with the Cleveland Indians.
Gotcha. Interesting. And so now let's deal with Bud Selig here. Now, all this is going on. There's still it's still in the air. There's whispers that Milwaukee is interested in this team, but there's still no definitive answer where they're going to play. Are they going to go play in Seattle for another year, or are they going to play in Milwaukee? So emerges Bud Selig, this powerful car dealer, started out with unlimited wealth, and he has to basically go to court and prove that the pilots are bankrupt and that they're unable to carry on, and that they have to, that's the only thing that's going to save the club is for them to actually relocate. He has to prove that in court, correct?
Yeah. That's correct. And Bob Schoenbacher is a guy who was a big part of that. Bob was the money guy. And he knew, he just went in, he basically said, look, we've got no revenue sharing for 3 years. We've got only 20% of the concessions are ours because we had to borrow money from the concessioner to buy the team in the first place. We've got a $4 million loan from Bank of California, I think it was. I can't remember the bank, but we got a $4 million loan, and they're calling the loan. There's no way we can pay that off. We can't pay our players, players, and if we don't pay them by X date, they're free agents. And if they're free agents, we don't have a team anyway. So they just said we can't do it. We don't have the money, and the court. There were people locally who were trying to buy the team, but they couldn't come up with the money to pay off the $4 million loan and stuff like that. Texas, Houston, and Dallas. Well, I can't remember whether it's Houston or Dallas. There was a guy who lived in Dallas and wanted to have a team in Houston, or lived in Houston and wanted to have a team in Dallas. I can't remember which way it went.
Right.
And he was making a play for it, but by that time, I think Selig, being an insider, having already made a deal in Chicago that got turned down, having already been a player with the Milwaukee Braves, they left because Milwaukee gave them a better deal than, Atlanta gave them a new stadium, just like you were talking about earlier. They left Milwaukee for that reason. So Bud was just sitting there waiting, and he wasn't super rich at the time, but he had a team of people, all these bigwig, major corporate leaders, who had money behind them, had formed a group right after the Braves left. So he had a group of 5 or 6 guys that were really moneyed interests, who were behind him.
And he was
the one who put it together.
And he's intent on getting a baseball team no matter what. It's pretty obvious that he has ambitions about this. Now, I also read in the book, and I wanted to make sure that this was correct. Lamar Hunt also made a bid for that team?
Yeah, he's the Texas guy.
Okay. Now, October 2nd, 1969, the last game in Pilots history. Miguel Fuentes is the last pitcher to pitch for the Pilots. And I did find it interesting that in the offseason, Miguel Fuentes is murdered in a bar fight, correct?
I know. It's so much irony in that.
Yeah.
Here's the guy. He makes the last appearance of a team that nobody knows yet is going bankrupt.
Uh-huh.
He's the last guy to get on the mound. He's an up-and-comer. He's got his whole career and life in front of him.
Right.
The team goes bankrupt, and that winter, he's killed in a bar fight.
Right.
And I think in the Dominican Republic, he never throws another pitch.
Yeah, unbelievable. Unbelievable. So, fast forward, 1970, spring training. Now, there's a lot of limbo going in here. They still haven't been told that they're going to Milwaukee. There's still this court case with Bud Selig and everything that's going on there. So, literally, what is it, 6 days before opening day, the trucks are packed in spring training, Arizona. They're ready to go. The trucks just need to know, are we going to Seattle or are we going to Washington, correct? Isn't that the way that I'm reading this?
The Seattle Pilots started spring training of 1970 as the Seattle Pilots. They ended spring training of 1970 as the Seattle Pilots. As spring training ended in 1970, there were still Seattle Pilots. Topps Baseball Company took pictures of all of the team as Seattle Pilots. There are no Topps baseball cards of 1970 of the Milwaukee Brewers. They are all listed and pictured as Seattle Pilots.
Are those cards collector's items now, do you think?
Yes, they are.
That's interesting.
Yeah. There's no Kansas City. I mean, there's no Milwaukee Brewers 1970 cards. They're all listed as Seattle Pilots. So anyway, here they are, 6 days, and the trucks are waiting in Utah to be told which way to go. And they get a phone call. They say, head east. You are now the Milwaukee Brewers.
Unbelievable.
So the trucks head east with all the uniforms in the truck that still say Seattle Pilots.
Right.
The trucks end up in Milwaukee like 3 days before the season starts. The Milwaukee Brewers call this company that does all the sports teams' uniforms, cleans them and all that stuff, and football teams and all that. And they say, look, we're desperate. We've got these uniforms. We need some seamstress to take all the patches off and put Milwaukee Brewers on these uniforms. So on opening day, 1970, the Milwaukee Brewers take the field in Seattle Pilots uniforms.
That is so funny. I mean,
with new patches on it.
Right. And, it's like little iron-ons on top of the old logos. It's so funny. Like, I can't even believe that. So, just to reiterate to the audience, it's 6 days before opening day. The trucks are completely packed in Utah. They're ready to go. They just need to know, do we go to Milwaukee or Seattle? Finally, they get the word. They go to Seattle. And they don't even have Brewers uniforms. They don't have logos. They don't have anything at this time. And it's all kind of...
Yeah, they go to Milwaukee.
I'm sorry, they go to Milwaukee. Right, and they don't have Brewers uniforms and logos. And they kind of, mold over top of one another. It's pretty funny stuff there. Now,
that's exactly what they did. You could actually see the Seattle, the remnants of Seattle on those uniforms still. Now, let me tell you a story, and I think this is a little bit of it is in the book.
Mm-hmm.
I learned this right before the book went to print. Some guy, the book is on pre-sale on Facebook at the time,
mm-hmm.
and a guy contacts me, and he says, you know what? I know the guy whose mom was the seamstress.
Really?
Who took the patches off. and here's what happened. So he says, I know, I got this guy's number. You want to talk to him? And I said, well, sure. So this guy's talking to me. It's like 2 days before my book goes to print.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy says, yeah, my grandmother worked for that cleaning company, and she's the one who they contacted and said, do you know any seamstress? And she says, my daughter's a seamstress, and it's this kid's mom. And so this little kid, at the age of about 8 years old, one by one, carries the uniforms up to his mom upstairs while she's on her sewing machine, sewing on all these patches. Well, she keeps all of the pilot's patches.
Wow.
And what she does with the patches is she takes them and she gives them to all the team moms on this guy's Little League team and says, sew these on the T-shirts of our team. And in 1970, the Seattle Pilots 1969 Major League patches take the field in Milwaukee on a Little League sandlot team.
Wow. That is unbelievable. That is a great
And
story.
I got about a paragraph in the book. I couldn't get the whole story there because it would change the page. And then they said, we'll let you put in 3 or 4 lines, but you can't put the whole story there because they'll change the page numbers. And so all I could get in was a real short explanation of that. But
Wow.
I got it in right at the last.
That's a really great story. Thank you for sharing that. Now, one thing before we get out of here that I do want to say that automatically, the Brewers had a better deal automatically. Isn't it true they only had to pay $1 a year in rent until they scored 1 million people?
Yeah, Bud made that deal. I mean, and they had a good stadium. I mean, they had the stadium.
County Stadium, sure.
Mm-hmm. And they had all those rich people who were already backing up the team.
Mm-hmm.
Every time they ran into a problem, they called them in a room and said, "Okay, we got to do this to make this work." And they all put money on the table. And I mean, it was just night and day between Seattle and. I mean,
Yeah.
the Sorianos were hung out to dry.
Yeah.
No rich people. You got to remember. 1970 was the year that Boeing went bust, and the sign on the billboard said, "Will the last people leaving Seattle turn out the lights?" And the stadium that turned out to be the Kingdome, which was supposed to be built in 1972, didn't get built until 1976. So they never would have made it.
Right.
Anyway.
Never. So, how much basically did Bud Selig buy the pilots for?
Well, the rumor is he only put in $300,000 of his own money.
Wow.
Now that franchise is worth $1.2 billion.
Yeah, exactly. And the Mariners are worth like 1.57 somewhere in there billion, right?
Yeah.
So
exactly.
I guess both cities kind of make out well, and they both get baseball in the end. But what an amazing story. And I got to tell you, Rick, let me show this book up here one more time. I'm speaking to author Rick Allen, who wrote the book Inside Pitch. I love the way you piggybacked off of Jim Bouton and the clubhouse experts with the front office, and I really, really loved your book. I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to me today, Mr. Allen.
Well, thank you, Jake. I really appreciate it. Hey, leave me a review on Amazon if you read the book and loved it. Put something on there. I'm trying to sell books.
I absolutely will. And tell my audience, how do we get this book Inside Pitch? What's the best way?
Well, you can go to Amazon. They're also at Barnes & Noble or any independent bookstore. You can order them through an independent bookstore. Or you can go to www.rickallenauthor.com, and I'm selling author-signed books, first edition books.
Awesome.
To people who want to do that. And if they go to www.com, rickallenauthor.com, they can order through Amazon. There's a link to Amazon. There's a link to Barnes & Noble, or there's author-signed books, any of those.
And I highly recommend the book. I have an audience that is full of readers. And quite honestly, I hadn't read a book in a long time. And I sat down, I read this, and I loved every page of the story. And I hope that the audience will go out and love it too. Mr. Allen, you are welcome back on this show anytime you have a book that you want to promote. It doesn't even have to be baseball. You just send me a message, and we'll get you on here. I loved having you on here. I love the way you sat here. And, we went through some technical difficulties, but you hung in there with me, and I love you for that. And thank you so much before I let you go here.
Well, thank you, Jake. It's, you gave me your time too, and I really appreciate it. Thanks very much.
I will make sure that you get a link of this interview. Once I get it into post-production, I'll send you a link of it, okay?
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much.
All right, Mr. Allen. Thank you so much, and have a great, great weekend.
Yep, you too. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye. And there you have it, folks. One-on-one with Rick Allen, the author of this book, Inside Pitch. Like I said, it was a great book, great read, a lot of stuff that I did not know, and a great story behind the scenes that I had never quite heard of before. So, if you get a chance, go out and, like you said, go on Amazon, pick up the book. It's a very good book. I'm Jake Robinson. This is Launch Angle. I got a couple shows coming up this week. I have Bob Kendrick, the curator of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. He's going to come in on Wednesday or Tuesday, I believe. We're going to have a sit-down, Zoom sit-down, talk-to-talk, one-on-one. Looking forward to that. I also got the book Wax Pack. It was It was highly recommended to me by Bill Lee. If you remember the Bill Lee interview that I did a couple months back, if you haven't, shame on you. Go to YouTube and the Let's Talk Baseball Podcast Network channel, and you can check out the Bill Lee interview. But in the interview, Bill Lee recommended this book, Wax Pack, where the author goes out and he buys 2 packs of baseball cards, and he basically opens up the pack of baseball cards and goes around the country and interviews the guys. So it's been a pretty good read so far, and I'm loving where it's going. So we're going to have that author in a couple of days. It's just a whirlwind busy at the Let's Talk Baseball Podcast Network. I'm Jake Robinson. I'm coming out of Pawleys Island, South Carolina. I want to thank all of you for coming out. I want to give a shout out to my boy Mikey Ford, one of the greatest writers around, young writers. You can see him on YouTube. You can find him on Twitter. And I believe, I don't want to give you the wrong handle. You can check him out on Facebook. It's Michael Ford, and he's a very good writer. Sal Angeletti with his Talking Baseball radio show. Check out all these things. We got a lot of things going on at the Let's Talk Baseball Podcast Network. But as for me, I'm going to sign out. I want to thank you all for coming out. God bless and good night.